Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Second Chronicles. Second Chronicles, and we'll be looking there for our lesson this morning. It's good to see each one of you here. It's good to be with you. And we are coming back to the Old Testament as we're going through. If you're visiting with us, one of the things that I try to do all along is just preach through the Bible, taking at least one sermon from each book. We recently had a couple of lessons from the book of Isaiah. It's been some time since we've been in the narrative. In fact, 1 Corinthians, we looked at over a year ago. It was back in November of 2019. We've been looking at prophets. We've been looking at the supplementary narrative or the other narrative that we might find in 1st and 2nd Kings. But now coming back to 2nd Chronicles, which lines up with some of the narrative of the book of Isaiah. And I want to notice some things as we consider that book. It's not a book that we generally turn to for its own sake. Most of the time when we open up 1st and 2nd Chronicles, what we're doing is supplementing what we consider maybe the main narrative of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. 2nd Chronicles lines up with 1st and 2nd Kings, particularly taking the reign of Solomon as well as the divided kingdom and the period of Judah alone. But it is distinct in that it takes only the history, or at least mostly the history, of the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is hardly mentioned at all. It is some, but only in so much as it interacts with the southern kingdom. Jeroboam is mentioned as the kingdom first fractures. Ahab is mentioned because he has considerable interaction with Jehoshaphat. But for the most part, the stories that are focused on in 1st and 2nd Kings that give attention to the northern kingdom are entirely left out of the book of 2nd Chronicles. And 1st Chronicles for that matter. Though 1st Chronicles deals more with David and his preparation for the temple. One of the things that we noticed as we went through 1st Chronicles is that along with 2nd Chronicles, it seems to be written in preparation for the return of God's people as they're rebuilding the temple. We see time markers in the genealogies that are given at the beginning of 1st Chronicles. We see another time marker as we see the conclusion of 2nd Chronicles lining up almost exactly with the beginning of the book of Ezra. Most commentators believe, in fact, that Ezra was the one who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles. While I do think that it is maybe appropriate to use these books as supplementary histories to the other narratives, I do think that we can put them together and get a more complete picture of all the things that happened during the time period of Solomon's reign in the divided kingdom and then Judah alone. I think that there's purpose that the book has in and of itself. This history is written for a particular reason and not just to, quote, tell the rest of the story. It's not just to add to maybe the things that they forgot in 1st and 2nd Kings, but rather it's particularly focused on the needs of these people. What do they need to know about their history as they're going back and rebuilding the temple? And I want to make sure that we're getting that message, that we're getting the message that those people were supposed to get from here. I say all that not to say that there's anything wrong with taking the historical value of these books. I believe that any book that talks about historical events in the Bible is the best history you're going to get. I mean, it's good, factual. It's as accurate a picture of history as you're going to get because it's inspired history. And that's wonderful. But it's also purposefully told history. Parts are being left out, parts are being included, and those parts are being left out or included with purpose in order to say something specific. And that's certainly the case as we come into 2nd Chronicles. We are including things that are left out. In fact, in the Septuagint version of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the name for those books is things left out, is the way that they translate these two books. Well, I think it's more than just things left out, but that's the way that those translators were looking at it. They just came to these books and said, oh, here's an appendix. But it's not an appendix. In fact, I think it's written much later, and I think as we'll look at some of the comparisons between what we see here and what we see in 1st and 2nd Kings, we'll see some reasons. We'll see some needed messages for the remnant who's returning. If we're breaking down the book into an outline form, it does break down into the first 9 chapters as being the reign of Solomon. That's helpful to remember because the first book breaks down into the first 9 chapters, although considerably less exciting material being the genealogies in the first Chronicles. But here too, the first 9 chapters are their own section, and they are about Solomon, and particularly Solomon's building of the temple, because that's what gains the most focus as his reign is being described to us. The rest of it is the divided kingdom. Now, we might break that down once more from 32 to 36 as Judah alone, but that distinction is not as clearly made here as it would be in 2 Kings, for instance, where our focus has been on both kingdoms and then it moves to just one. Our focus is the one kingdom the whole time. And so as you're reading through and you come to chapter 32, it's not this sharp break that you see as you're reading along. You just understand that when Assyria comes down into Judah, you just know what's already happened. And so they don't make a big deal about it here. I think one of the reasons that Israel, the northern kingdom, is left out so much is that that's not who this book is being written to. The book is being written to the captives who are returning, and they are of the southern kingdom, and it's their history that is particularly being focused on and that they need to learn lessons from. And so we'll try to learn those lessons, as I say, going through the lesson this morning. I appreciate Cody reading from chapter 6 of the prayer that Solomon offered as he dedicated the temple. And I just want to begin by looking at one verse out of that prayer, out of a portion of that prayer that Cody read for us. Chapter 6 and verse 14 of 2 Chronicles, he said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven or on earth, keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to your servants who walk before you with all their heart." I believe the idea of who God is, his unique character, and his interaction with his people is much the purpose, much the theme of the book of 2 Chronicles. And so I want to show that comparison and show that relationship between God and his people as illustrated in this book. Well, looking then at the faithfulness of God, he is a faithful God of an unfaithful people. And that is not a unique theme to 2 Chronicles, but it is certainly a pervasive one here. Just beginning at the start of this book, and incidentally, this book was broken up into multiple parts later, but I think we can see the wisdom in the way that it was broken up. I think it is a clean break that we see. But it starts in verse 1 of chapter 1. "Now Solomon the son of David established himself securely over his kingdom, and the Lord his God was with him and exalted him greatly." Now, notice it does say that Solomon established himself securely, but also that God was with him and exalted him greatly. God's involvement is all through the book. No matter what men are doing, God is also doing something. And sometimes it is working in conjunction with what those men are doing, as we see here. At other times, it is working in the very opposite direction of what those men are trying to accomplish. So over in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, and 2 Chronicles chapter 21, beginning in verse 16, when Jehoram comes to the throne, it says that in verse 16, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines and of the Arabs who bordered the Ethiopians, and they came against Judah and invaded it and carried away all the possessions found in the king's house, together with his sons and his wives, so that no son was left to him except Jehoahaz, the youngest of his sons. So after all this, the Lord smote him in his bowels with an incurable sickness. Now that's very distinct from what it says God was with Solomon and building him up and all the things he's doing increase Solomon's kingdom. And here, one of Solomon's grandsons comes to the throne, and it says that God is working against him, using other nations to work against him. And we constantly see God's hands very much involved in the history. And I think as they're reading through that, they're meant to see that it is not God sitting back and just seeing what happens. At no point in this do we see God just waiting, see how it turns out. But God is actively either encouraging and building up, or he is discouraging and tearing down. But it is always God at the back of things. He is always in the midst of what is happening to his people. He is also a faithful God. And all of my points are up there already, I just realized. So I'm just going to set that over there. He is a faithful God. All through this book, it is reminding us that he is a God who does exactly what he says he will do. In chapter 1 and verse 9, in fact, 4 times beginning in chapter 1 and verse 9, Solomon brings up this characteristic of God. It says, "Now, O Lord, your promise to my father David is fulfilled, for you have made me a king over a people as numerous as the dust of the earth." And then 3 more times, beginning in chapter 6 and verse 10, he brings up this fulfillment of the promise. "Now the Lord has fulfilled his word which he spoke, for I have risen in the place of my father David, and to sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel." Again in verse 15 and 16, he says, who has kept with your servant David, my father, that which you have promised him. Indeed, you have spoken with your mouth and have fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day. Now therefore, O Lord, the God of Israel, keep your servant David, my father, keep with your servant David, my father, that which you have promised him, saying, you shall not like a man to sit on the throne of Israel, if only your sons take heed to their way, to walk in my law, as you have walked before me. And then again, finally, over in chapter 7 and in verse 19, chapter 7 and verse 19, "But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you today, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot you from my land, which I have given you, and this house, which I have consecrated for my name, will be cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all the peoples." Excuse me, that was a transition there. So Solomon brings up the promises these 3 times, and then coming into chapter 7, he brings up God's pronouncements of judgment. And he says that here God has said he would do all of this. He would keep a man of David's house on the throne, that he would do so if only they would follow his word and the law. But then he also brings up at the dedication that God has also said he will bring calamity and destruction. And so as the children of Israel are going back and they're reading through this history, they're recounting all the promises God has already kept. That's how it starts. And then the warnings, other promises that God will keep if they do not follow with their end of the covenant, as it were. They get to the end of this book in chapter 36. In chapter 36 and in verse 15. And it says, "The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand. All the articles of the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his officers, he brought them all to Babylon. They burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed all its valuable articles. Those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, and all the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath, until 70 years were complete." So It's not just that God keeps his promises in the delightful way, that he says he will bring about good things, but also the curses, the things, the consequences. God proves in this particular history, I will keep those promises too. And so we see his faithfulness in that, and we should rejoice in his faithfulness in that. Over in 2 Chronicles chapter 19 then, another characteristic of God that we see here is that he is just. In 2 Chronicles chapter 19, Jehoshaphat has come to the throne, and he begins to make reforms. And among the reforms that he brings are that he sets judges throughout the city to adjudicate cases and also to instruct the people concerning the law. And it says, beginning in verse 5, he appointed judges in the land and all the fortified cities of Judah, city by city. He said to the judges, consider what you are doing, for you do not judge for man, but for the Lord, who is with you when you render judgment. Now then, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be very careful what you do, for the Lord our God will have no part in unrighteousness or partiality or the taking of a bribe. In Jerusalem also, Jehoshaphat appointed some of the Levites and the priests and some of the heads of the fathers' houses of Israel for the judgment of the Lord and to judge disputes in the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Then he charged them, saying, You shall do in the fear of the Lord faithfully and wholeheartedly. Whenever any dispute comes to you from your brethren who live in their cities between blood and blood, between law and commandment, statutes and ordinances, you shall warn them so that they may not be guilty before the Lord, and wrath may not come upon you and your brethren. Thus you shall do, and you will not be guilty. Notice as he sets all of these things up, he sets them up on the basis of who God is and what he will or will not be a part of. God, he says there back in verse 7, will have no part in unrighteousness or partiality or the taking of bribe. And so what Jehoshaphat seeks to do is set up fairness, set up justice. How does that happen? But that people would apply God's word faithfully, that they would hear both sides of the case, that they would judge the way God would judge, that there would be extensions of his fairness and justice. And so it is on the basis of who he is that these things would be set up. Back over in chapter 6 in verse 35. Going back to verse 34, it says, When your people go out to battle against their enemies, by whatever way you shall send them, and they pray to you toward this city that you have chosen, and the house which I have built for your name, then hear from heaven their prayer and their supplication, and maintain their cause. This is an interesting verse because the word cause there is the same as judgment or justice that we see in the Old Testament. Maintain their cause. Maintain their just cause. Now, we know that when they go to war, and they are going to war because God is bringing judgment on them, that they have no just cause. And that God will not maintain their justice. But Solomon prays, basically saying, when righteous people, when good, righteous people call out to you, call out to your house, I know that you'll treat them justly. That you'll maintain their just cause. Down in 39 of the same chapter then, it says, Then hear from heaven, from your dwelling place, their prayer and supplication, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. And so even there's something of justness, not only in the people who are right, but the people who come to God in the right way. That God will not just give justice in the sense of bringing down judgment, though that is justice. But there's also a sense in which justice can be given to those who are asking for forgiveness. Their cause can be maintained. Their justness can be maintained. And so Solomon appeals to God on that basis. And we see that characteristic scattered throughout, that God is the just God, that they can count on him, that they can count on his fairness, and they can base the fairness that they extend to the people when we have just kings like Jehoshaphat, can extend that fairness and justice to the people. Another thing that we see about God is that he is long-suffering. That is certainly illustrated not only here, but of course throughout the Old Testament, New Testament as well, but throughout Judah's history. Again and again, we see that God is long-suffering. Back in chapter 7 and verse 3, at the dedication of the temple, it says, all the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, truly he is good, his loving kindness is everlasting. That idea of his loving kindness is everlasting, it is inexhaustible. As we go back to Exodus chapter 34, we see that combined with the other elements of who God is, that he is compassionate and gracious, full of loving kindness. And it says that relenting of evil. And you see that relenting of evil, that hesitation from God. He does not want to bring calamity on his people, but he certainly will as a last resort. Over in chapter 20, and in verse 21, in chapter 20, and in verse 21, it says there that when he had consulted with the people, he appointed those who sang to the Lord and those who praised him in holy attire. This is Jehoshaphat's singing victory over his enemies. When he consulted with the people, it appointed those who sang to the Lord and those who praised him in the holy attire as they went out before the army and said, give thanks to the Lord, for his loving kindness is everlasting. And when they began singing and praising, the Lord set ambushes against the sons of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, who had come against Judah, so that they were routed. The idea that singing, holding up God's character and his goodness, and singing that before the people is the thing that would give you victory over the people. Not only is it a characteristic, but it's a characteristic that they were, in this case, very literally leaning upon. His kindness and long-suffering, his goodness to his people. And they needed to remember that as they were coming back to rebuild the temple. In all of this, I suggest to you that the people were supposed to, as they extended that depiction of God to the people around them, they were supposed to be drawing all men towards God. And that is truly all men towards God. In the first place, of course, they themselves ought to have been drawn near, but also their unfaithful brethren. In chapter 30, we see the reinstitution of the Passover among the reforms that Hezekiah was making. And in doing so, it says in chapter 30 and verse 1, now Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh so that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover to the Lord God of Israel. And so they didn't just write off their unfaithful brethren, but they continued to try to draw them back, or at least those who are faithful, try to draw even those brethren back to come and to worship God. Back in chapter 6, again, as the temple is being dedicated in that prayer that Solomon has offered, chapter 6 and verse 32, as Solomon is considering all those who might be drawn near, he goes through and talks about God's people and how they might come into calamity, but if they would turn, he prays that God would listen to them. But he also says in verse 32, also concerning the foreigner, who is not from your people Israel, when he comes from a far country, for your great name's sake and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when they come and pray towards this house, then hear from heaven, from your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name, and fear you, as do your people Israel, that they may know that this house which I have built is called by your name. That idea of drawing all people to God and doing it by proclaiming and displaying the character of God to all who are around about. There's there's two categories, we might say, in which God's character is described here. One is a character that is unique to God. That is, he rules above all. We don't get to take on that character of God. That's his. He is entirely faithful. That is, he fulfills everything that he says he will do, he will do. We are at least limited in fulfilling our vows. We say, if the Lord wills. The Lord doesn't say, if the people will. It's his will that we are dependent on, not his on us. But then there are characteristics that we are supposed to emulate, such as his justice and his long-suffering and his kindness. That these are characteristics that we are supposed to take on ourselves. And as we see that there are ways in which people might consider those elements positive, and then there's ways in which they might consider those things negative. And there are people who will be drawn to God for those characteristics, and there are people who will hate God because of those characteristics. And Israel, Judah, has some of those, both of those kinds of people, even in their own midst, much less in the world around. But we need to faithfully proclaim the characteristics that are uniquely God's without apology, and to live out those characteristics which are ours to emulate. Well, how did Israel do? Not well, of course. They are an unfaithful people, and 2 Chronicles certainly tells that story. How are they unfaithful? Well, idolatry is certainly an ever-present concern throughout Israel's history, and particularly during this time. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24 and verse 18, it says, "They abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and served the Asherim and the idols. So wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this their guilt." Chapter 33 and in verse 7, we see how far they were willing to go. Manasseh, who spent more time on the throne than any king of Judah, spent his time taking Judah as far down the path as he could before a final repentance that we'll look at a little bit later. But it tells us how far he went in verse 7. "Then he put the carved image of the idol which he had made in the house of God, of which God had said to David and to Solomon his son, 'In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever.'" Notice the emphasis there, the contrast. It doesn't just tell us that he did this, but as the children of Israel are reading this, they see what Manasseh did, and then right after that it says, let me just remind you where he just did this. What this house is supposed to mean, the uniqueness of this place. And he thought nothing of just walking in there with the violation of the very foundations of God's law. "Thou shalt not worship other gods. No other God before me." He is going all the way back and breaking the very foundations of our relationship with God. And let me just say, that is, idolatry is the foundation of the relationship with God, or putting away idolatry. That he will have first place. And I think we need to recognize that importance as idolatry comes up again and again. I think we merely look at it as foolish and old superstition. It is not. It is a constant battle for God's people to remember to put him at the forefront, to where nothing has any competition with him. And so it is just as much a difficulty for us today. Well, we see also another theme that I think is very important, and that is the influence of others, the evil influence that they invite into their lives time and time again. One commentator suggested, well, a few commentators have argued against Ezra being the author, and one in particular argued against it because he said he did not see the language here dealing with the intermarriage with foreign wives who would bring idolatry into the land. Of particular note, we see that Solomon's wives, his unfaithfulness because of his wives, are not given attention. though I think in chapter 8 and verse 11 that it is at least hinted at. In chapter 8 and verse 11, it tells us that Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house which he had built for her, and he said, "My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy where the ark of the Lord has entered." It doesn't go on to say about his heart being led away. That's over in 1 Kings, and we see that clearly depicted there. So why would that be? Why would they leave out? Why would the historian leave that out? Well, I think what is being given here is a picture of Israel's high point in Solomon and in the temple and in that glorious moment. And just as we saw in 1 Chronicles, we didn't detract from the glory of the promises made to David by focusing on his sin with Bathsheba, not even mentioned. Same here, I think that we're not detracting from this moment in Israel's history. That's the important part. Who is Israel at this moment? And Israel is at the peak at this moment. And so it doesn't go over and say, by the way, Solomon ended up pretty badly. It's telling us this climax. And then it wants us to show us the nation's decline. So I think that's a likely reason why it might leave that out. But not so much that it wouldn't at least mention it. And mention it in a way where, like when Solomon began that path, he began that path understanding the difficulty. Understanding that bringing in a woman to live in a place with her idols where God's ark has ever even been, it just cannot be. And then we know the rest of the story. And we know that he did continue to invite wives. And at some point, this level of concern goes away. And his heart is eventually led away. But also, we see other women. And another commentator, in response to the one saying wives are not mentioned here, suggested that if you look, you can see a number of places where people are making poor marriage decisions and it is affecting the nation. Rehoboam, it tells us in chapter 11 and verse 21, tells us who his favorite wife was. Rehoboam loved Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, more than all his other wives and concubines. For he had taken 18 wives and 60 concubines and fathered 28 sons and 60 daughters. Well, that's maybe ominous, but not so bad. It's ominous because it's the daughter of Absalom, the one who tried to usurp the throne. And so we can see some potential difficulties, but we don't have to wonder whether that's simply making a suggestion. Because over in chapter 15 and verse 16, it says that Asa also removed Maacah, the mother of King Asa, yes, Asa. He removed his mother, Maacah, from the position of being queen mother because she had made a horrid image as an Asherah, and Asa cut down her horrid image, crushed it, and burned it in the brook Kidron. So, bad choices. It's not just that he took on several wives, but his favorite wife ends up being kind of a mess and ends up having to be removed because she brings idolatry in. Maybe the most infamous, though, of course, is the alliance that Jehoshaphat makes. Over in chapter 20, in chapter 20 in verse 35, it says, "After this, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, allied himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel. He acted wickedly in doing so." Over in chapter 21 in verse 6, we see the consequences of that alliance, where it tells us that Jehoram walked in the way of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab did, for Ahab's daughter was his wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so Athaliah, of course, is brought up here in that context. It is interesting with Jehoshaphat here how starkly his alliance is condemned back in chapter 20. Over in 1 Kings, it tells us that he makes this alliance, and it certainly gives us a negative depiction, but it doesn't say it quite as distinctly as it does here in chapter 20 and verse 35 when it says he acted wickedly in doing so. In fact, it goes on and says, so he allied himself with him to make ships to go to Tarshish, and they made the ships in Ezion-Geber. And then Eleazar, the son of Durvahu of Marishah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you've allied yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has destroyed your works. So the ships were broken and could not go to Tarshish. Over in 1 Kings, it tells us that Jehoshaphat had a wake-up call there. Because Ahaziah comes back and says, hey, let's try again. And Jehoshaphat goes, nah, I'm good. I think I'll learn my lesson here. And it doesn't even tell us that. And I wonder if in Chronicles, it's not so concerned about telling us that Jehoshaphat came around, but rather telling us about the misery that comes from this alliance that he makes with Ahab, both in his generation and in the generation to come. And as these people are coming back and they're coming to rebuild the temple, one of the things God wants them to know is the reason you fell is that you did not keep yourselves morally separated from the people who are around you. And maybe they heard and learned that lesson, because we see that when the Samaritans wanted to come and participate in the rebuilding efforts, they said to them, what part do we have with each other? And so maybe they caught it, and maybe they got that lesson. Maybe we could catch and get that lesson. Their lack of trust is a major issue throughout of the kings, that they do not trust in the God who has been faithful and who has delivered them so often. Over in chapter 16 and in verse 7, at that time it says, Hanani the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, because you have relied on the king of Aram and have not relied on the Lord your God, therefore the army of the king of Aram has escaped out of your hand. Here is that moment where Asa, after being someone who has relied on the Lord, then turns and makes a political alliance in order to push back Baasha, the king of the north. He makes this alliance with the king of Aram, does not consult God, does not rely or lean on God. And in his case, we continue his story down to verse 12, and it tells us in the 39th year of his reign, Asa became diseased in his feet, and his disease was severe. Yet even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord, but the physicians. So here, one of the good kings, we are given the sort of bad report at the end, and in explicit terms, it seems. Here is Asa, who started off so well and sort of began and continued down a path of distrust of God, so that in its very dying moments, yet even, it says, in his dying moments, he did not appeal to God. And I think to highlight that, there's so many kings that don't trust God, but to highlight it from the standpoint of here's a king that you might have thought favorably about. Even God says favorable things. But here's the path he took. And so it's showing Israel all the wrong paths. And all of this stems from the fact that they were not devoted to God. Over in chapter 12 and verse 14. Chapter 12 and verse 14. Speaking of Rehoboam, it says he did evil because he did not set his heart to seek the Lord. That's at the core. That's the very heart of the problem here, is that they're not devoted in a very deep, in a way that comes from the heart. They're not devoted to him. And it shows eventually anyone who is not devoted to God, it will out. And it did with them. And it resulted, of course, in their destruction, which is the final thing that we'll look at, is God's judgment, but also some hope. The judgment seems to be the thing that the book is constantly pressing to, at least beginning in chapter 10, as we see the divide of the kingdom and we see the continual warnings, and maybe even beginning all the way back with Solomon as he warns of it reminds of the warnings that God has made of what will happen if they are unfaithful. And we're just kind of marching towards that moment that we read about earlier, when all of these things are destroyed, when it says that the temple finally is burned to the ground and the walls are torn down. The prophecies are all fulfilled, and God has done exactly what he said he would do. I think it's worth highlighting, especially in verse 17, where it says, therefore he, that is God, brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand. Again, what we said at the beginning, God is at the heart of all of this. And God makes no pretense about saying, it's not just I stepped out of the way. It's not just I allowed things to happen. God says, I brought it. I'm the one who stirred them up. I'm the one who gave you into their hand. And God wants them to know that the punishment, he is the source of it. I think that's an important thing to remember, because when we talk about judgment today, I don't want to credit God or speak on God's behalf and say he's bringing judgment when calamity falls on a particular people. But I think it is just as irresponsible to say he's not doing it. That's also speaking for God. And especially when people say foolish things like, God is not the source of those sorts of things. Disaster strikes. And they say those sorts of things, they come from the devil. They come from God. And he will bring those things. Now, I'm not saying he is the source of every one of those things. We see how God does allow Satan to act, for instance, in the case of Job. But we see here God saying, it's me. And I want you to know it's me. And I'm like the father who's coming in to chastise. And so when I remember, so many denominational preachers all the way back at 9/11 in 2001, getting up and talking about the punishment that was coming upon America. And people were so swift, religious people, my brethren were so swift in coming back and say, no, that's not the way God works. And I'm like, that's exactly the way God works. I'm not saying he did do that, but he could have. And I'll tell you this, we had plenty of reason for it. Like I wasn't over here going, no, that couldn't happen to us, to our country. No, very much we deserve it. And even if God's not doing it in the way that he's doing this here, we could have the same wake-up call that they ought to have had. And when calamity does strike, people learn all the wrong lessons, just like Judah did. Even at the very end of all of this, as the army is at the gates, the siege is there, it is certain, it is secure, and Jeremiah at the last is saying, here's one chance to at least reduce by a fraction the devastation that is coming. And even then, they would not learn the lesson. And they kept thinking, maybe there's a better way other than turning to God. So we leave off with this judgment. That's the seemingly, in our minds maybe, that's the final words. But they're not the final words. That isn't the end of the history that's being given to the people. They are given that brief moment at the end to sort of pick back up. Here's the destruction. We're not told anything of the 70 years of captivity. But it jumps immediately rather to the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. And he's given the order. And we're already to the hopeful moment. We're already ready to rebuild the temple. And I think about that the book starts out with the building of the temple. It ends with the destruction of the temple. But really, it ends with the rebuilding of the temple. So we've moved from this hopeful moment to this low moment. And then, hey, we could go back. We could rebuild it. And I think that hopeful ending is particularly hinted at throughout the book of 2 Chronicles. And maybe for all of Israel's unfaithfulness, the opportunity to return to God is even a more present theme than their unfaithfulness, or at least as present. Notice in chapter 29, as you're reading through and you're looking at what is told to us about each king, and in some cases, very little is told to us. But here, beginning in chapter 29, not only do we spend a great deal of time with Hezekiah, but we spend a great deal of time with one particular moment in Hezekiah's reign. And that is the moment that his reforms lead to this restoration of the Passover. And he begins preparing there in chapter 29. And in chapter 30, he begins to invite others to the Passover. They arrive, and there's not been enough time. Things are so far from where they ought to be that they have not had time to cleanse the people, even after the sort of 2-week grace period that was in the law. And so they celebrated the Passover even though they were unclean, while Hezekiah prayed to God that he would forgive the people and that he would accept this worship. Chapter 31, it says, building on that, now when this was finished, all Israel who were present went out to the cities of Judah and broke the pillars in pieces and cut down the Asherim and pulled down the high places and the altars throughout all Judah and Benjamin, as well as in Ephraim and Manasseh, until they had destroyed them all. Then all the sons of Israel returned to their cities, each to his possession. Notice that. Even in Ephraim and Manasseh. Do you ever hear about the Northern Kingdom revival? I don't. But it's there, at least for a moment. For a moment, there's enough zeal that even people in the Northern Kingdom take hold of that, and they go down, tear down their high places. And so for 4 chapters, he goes on telling us about this faithful man, this faithful king who is able to revive. And then the result of all of that in chapter 32, here at the very moment when God is bringing Assyria down to judge the northern kingdom, and they are going to be taken away, Judah escapes. And it coincides with this moment of revival. This moment of restoration and coming back and serving God, and the people taking up that zeal and breaking down their high places. And the enemy comes to the gate, and Hezekiah, along with Isaiah, who is mentioned here, they faithfully meet that man with appeals to God, with humility. And God drives the most powerful army in the world away in a moment. And you talk about reading your history and what you need to learn from it. Here is what can happen even to an unfaithful people who are weak and beat down and a shadow of what they used to be. But if they turn to God, why, they can defeat the most powerful army in the world. It even gives us hope in the lowest story that it tells us, Hezekiah's son. We go from that high point in chapter 32 to the low point of Manasseh in chapter 33, that longest reigning king. And for all the evil he did, 2 Chronicles includes what 2 Kings does not. When he was in distress after he'd been taken away to Babylon, when he was in distress, he entreated the Lord his God, and he humbled himself greatly before the God of his father. When he prayed to him, he was moved by his entreaty and heard his supplications and brought him again to Jerusalem, to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. I think the people could read that and they could think, that's us. We're Manasseh. And we've been taken away to Babylon. And we can appeal to God. And at the moment they're reading this, they could know he'll bring us back to Jerusalem. Because if he heard that guy's prayer, he could hear mine. And so we see a pattern. Over and over, God gives them a pattern and says, you have been unfaithful. But look back at the history again. Maybe in their minds, there they are in Babylon, and all they're thinking of is the judgment. All they're thinking of is what God has brought us to. But God says, did you miss it? That's not all that's going on. All along the way, I've shown you, you can come back, and even now, you can come back. And here is the way, through humbling ourselves before him. And he will hear. God spends a considerable amount of time, I think, defending his decisions. I think that's part of what 2 Chronicles is. Here they are, they've been in captivity, and God goes through and shows them, I have not been the one who's unfaithful. Again, you could imagine a Jew away in captivity thinking, well, finally, he didn't keep his promise. No, here's a book saying, I did. And even you being in Babylon is me keeping my promise. And he shows that over and over again, he appealed to them. He did everything on his part. The chapter 36, it starts with the destruction. It starts with, he sent his prophets. But they mocked and they ridiculed and they rejected. We are not human beings. We are not a people who are good at recognizing when things are our own fault. And we constantly look for other people to blame things on. God lets us and lets the people know our circumstances, such as this, are ours to take responsibility for. And he will deliver us from them if we would do so. His judgments are just, and we are the ones who are unjust. But for all that, as he is making his case against us, he's simultaneously sort of making a case for us. He's making known the path to reconciliation. What about you? Would you be reconciled to him this morning? Doesn't matter if you're Manasseh. And if you would, could you look at what Hezekiah is able to accomplish? What good does it do? So much. God can overcome things that you can't imagine if you would yield and submit your life to him. If there's any way that we can help you in that response, won't you come forward while we stand?